Hey everybody, Ron Bielefeld, Whistling Wings Photography. Welcome to another video. Today we're going to talk about setting up the R5, the R3, the R7. Applies to just about every Canon mirrorless camera, the use of custom shooting modes, C1, C2, C3. There seems to be still some confusion out there about how to set these up and how they actually react when you change settings, when you're actually in one of those modes. Stuff like that. So if you're interested in knowing more about setting up custom shooting modes in Canon mirrorless cameras like the R5, the R3, the R7, the R6, stay tuned. Okay, so custom shooting mode setup in Canon mirrorless cameras. Right here, got my R5. I've got an R3 and R7. Works on the R6 too. I think it's all pretty much the same now. The first thing we want to mention here, make sure your firmware is up to date in your camera. Because otherwise, how you set up, well, not so much how you set them up, but how they might behave, the custom shooting modes, could be different than what I'm going to talk about now, because this has to do with up-to-date cameras, right? The way, because firmware changes, updates have changed how custom shooting modes work to a point. Okay, so this is going to be best done inside the menu. I'm going to be inside the menu of my R5 here shortly, and we're going to go over how to set up custom shooting modes. Then we're going to talk about changing custom shooting mode settings, kind of in an interactive way. Then we're going to talk about when do these mode settings come into play, when do they change, when do they not change after you've made settings while you're actively shooting in one of these modes. And then how can we get them to basically automatically record any changes once we've originally set up a custom shooting mode. The first thing I want to talk about here before we get into the menus is how I use custom shooting modes. Different people use custom shooting modes. Again, we're talking about the C1, the C2, C3 in your Canon mirrorless camera. It goes along with manual mode and TV, shutter priority, AV, aperture priority, shooting modes. They're all in that list. FV now, flexible value, I don't know, shooting mode. It's in that list. If you hit the mode dial up here, and you can switch between them, they're up there. How do I use them though? I don't use them like some people use them. I use them to change between major changes in the type of shooting I'm doing. I don't use them for just changing shutter speed really fast or changing from perch birds to birds in flight. That I'm shooting in manual mode, and I just make those changes via changing my aperture, my ISO, and my shutter speed via the dials. How I use custom shooting modes is if I'm going from shooting birds or wildlife to shooting landscapes, or then shooting, let's say, astrophotography, shooting the Milky Way. There are major changes throughout the menus that are required when you go from those major shooting types of shooting or genres of shooting. There's major changes throughout all the menus. Not just changing shutter speed or aperture or something like that, faster and slower. That, hey, you can do that by setting up a back button, which is much quicker. Register and recall a shooting function. That's a different video. But anyway, that's how I use custom shooting modes. Shooting mode 1, let's just say C1, custom mode 1, set up for birds, wildlife shooting. Custom mode 2, set up for landscapes. Custom mode 3, set up, like I said, for shooting the Milky Way. The reason is because, let's say, shooting birds, just for an example. There's things that you have to change in a lot of the different menus. Autofocus menu, just as an example. When I'm shooting birds, I'm in servo autofocus. When I'm shooting landscapes, I'm in one shot. When I'm shooting astrophotography, I'm in bulb mode. Okay, so these are major changes throughout many of the menus. That's where going from C1 to C2 to C3 is a quick way to reset basically all of the menus in your camera for these different shooting types or genres of shooting. So that's how I use them. So now let's jump into the menu of my R5, and I'll go through how I generally set up my custom shooting modes, and then we'll go into these other subjects that I just mentioned earlier. Okay, here we are in the menu of my Canon R5, and we're talking about setting up custom shooting modes, C1, C2, C3. So to start this, let's start like we've never set up custom modes. None. Haven't done it. The best way to do this, and I think the best way to always do it, is to start. You're going to start, you don't start inside the custom mode, let's say C1, and start then changing settings on your camera. You start outside of the custom modes. So in this case, I'm going to start and I'm going to go to manual mode, M, and that's because that's the mode I want C1 to be in when I invoke it. When I go to C1, I want it to be in manual. The only way to associate a shooting mode to a custom shooting mode is to be in that mode when you register your camera settings to a custom mode. So if I want C1 to bring me into manual mode when I go to C1, I'm going to be in manual mode when I register the camera settings to C1. You'll see how this goes. But that's just the first setting we want registered to C1 when we do the registration process. We want to set up other things as well. So we're going to go through all the menus that we want to have specific settings saved to C1 before we go in and register them. From here, we'll go back into the menu and let's go all the way over to the shoot menu and make sure that we have everything set up the way we want it. So we're in tab 1 of the shoot menu. Image quality is C-RAW. That's fine. This all looks good. This all should look pretty good because I've got my manual mode in my camera, shooting mode set up basically for shooting birds in flight. So everything should be about where it needs to be, but we'll go through just like we're setting up a brand new custom shooting mode. This looks fine. Tab 2 of the shoot menu looks fine. Tab 3, got my white balance set where I want it. Got my picture. Everything here looks fine. Everything on tab 4 looks good. Tab 5, nothing going on there that we need to worry about. Here, shutter mode, electronic. I shoot almost always in electronic, so we'll keep that there. That's good. Everything in here looks good. Exposure simulation, want that on for birds in flight for sure. Enabled. Display performance, I want that set to smooth for birds in flight. That looks good. Autofocus, we want it to be in servo. Autofocus operation should be servo. Method right now, that'll be changeable when we're shooting, but mostly I shoot in zone, so we're going to leave it there. Subject to detect should be animals. Everything else in here, auto case, But let's say we've gone through all of our menus now, and we've got everything set up the way we want it for shooting birds in flight. Then we go in. Once we have everything set up the way we want, then we go into custom shooting mode. We hit the set button, and there it is, register settings. So we're going to go ahead and hit register settings. Boom. Which one do you want to register it to? Do you want to register it to C1, C2, or C3? We're going to do C1. Now, something to think about that you couldn't see within the menus here is what shutter speed, aperture, and ISO setting, you have set up, because those will be saved under this custom mode, this custom shooting mode. I'm going to quickly get out of here, and you can see my ISO, my aperture, and my shutter speed settings. Again, they don't really matter, but just point of emphasis, these will be saved. For birds in flight, you want higher shutter speeds, more wide open apertures, keep your ISO around 800 or something like that. Those can be changed as you're shooting within the custom mode. We'll talk about that in a little while. But I'm just showing you these will be saved. So now we go back into the menu. We go back where we were to register settings, and now we're going to hit C1. And go over to OK and hit set. It says busy for a second. Now, everything we just set is set into the custom mode C1 now. So if we go to C1, get out of the menu, come up here, go to C1, half press shutter button or whatever, there we are, we're in C1 now. You see in the upper corner there, upper left-hand corner, it says C1M. It says M because we were in manual shooting mode when we set up all this stuff and when we registered our functions and menu settings and everything to the C1. If you wanted that to be TV, you should have been working in the TV shooting mode. Or if you wanted it AV up there, C1 AV, you should have been working and changing all your settings in the AV shooting mode and then register all those settings to C1, C2, or C3, wherever you wanted them. That's what I mean. You start kind of from the beginning whenever you're doing C1, C2, C3. Just go get into the shooting mode you want to be associated with, that custom shooting mode, and then work through the menus and then register everything to that custom shooting mode. Now, the thing that we can look at here, we're in C1 now. If we go and we look, go back into the menus here and we go back, everything's going to be everything's going to be like we set them up. So then the next thing to talk about, let's go back, and you can see there's a setting down here called Auto Update Settings. We need to talk about this. It's disabled right now. That means when I'm shooting, if we get out of the menus, if I'm shooting in my C1 mode and I make any changes to aperture, to shutter speed, change my shutter speed, change my aperture, change my ISO settings, because auto update is disabled, these settings will only be saved while I remain in the C1 custom shooting mode. If the camera powers down automatically, or by me turning off the on-off switch, if I turn it back on, it will, I can't do that now because I'll disconnect from my recorder here, but if I did that and I come back, any changes I make to any of the settings here, and I'm just using aperture, ISO, and shutter speed as an example, will not have changed from what I changed them to. The only time they're going to change, so I made these changes. Let me bring ISO all the way up to say 51,200. Okay, so now that's not going to change. If I turn the camera off and back on, it's going to still be at 51,200 ISO. But if I get into a different mode, if I go into shooting mode, if I go into manual exposure mode, but now if I go back into C1, you're going to notice that ISO changed back to 800, what we had originally registered to C1. It is no longer at 51,200. That is when your settings for your custom modes kick back in. If you've been shooting in C1 and you've made a bunch of changes, but then you go out of C1 and come back into C1, everything's going to be back to the way it was according to the settings you originally registered in C1. If you want these settings, if you were in C1 now and we're changing things like shutter speed or ISO, and you want the camera to remember these settings and store them even after you get out of the C1 shooting mode, you need to set auto update settings to enabled. Now what'll happen, so we just did that and we get out of here, now what'll happen is if I change this back to 51,200 ISO again, and I did what I did before, and I get out of here and I go into M, if I go back now to C1, guess what it's going to be? It's going to be 51,200 because I had this setting, auto update settings, set to enabled. So that's how this works. If you don't want original settings that you registered to a custom shooting mode, in this case C1, to change as you're changing them and change permanently, make sure you have this set to disabled, and that's how I always have mine set. Because when I change something, so now I'm going to go back in here and I'm going to put this back, I'm going to put my ISO back to 800 where I want it. Well, let's just do this. Let's put it back there. Let's go back in here. Let's go back to enable. And then I'm going to get out and I'm going to set this back to 800 so that that's back to my original setting for C1M, C1 custom shooting mode. And it's going to register that now. So when I get out and then come back in like we just did, just another iteration, it's at 800. So now I'm going to, that's saved now again for that custom shooting mode. I'm going to go back here and disable this, and I'm shooting in C1. Any changes I make to these settings here, which are the ones you're changing most, right, your ISO and stuff like that, aren't going to permanently be saved to the C1 settings. They're only going to stay there until you get out of C1 into something else like TV, AV, or M, manual shooting mode, and then once you get back into C1, it'll be back to your original settings. So I hope that's not too confusing, but that's the way it works. Any settings you change when you're in a custom shooting mode now, unless you have the auto update settings enabled, will only be kind of semi-permanent. They'll be there as long as you stay in C1, whether the camera turns off or not. The only time they're going to revert back to the original settings you made for that custom shooting mode is if you get out of that shooting mode and then come back into it. Okay? I know, it's kind of confusing, but once you get going at it, you'll get it. It's good. It actually works really good now. The way it used to work, well, we'll talk about that. We'll get out of the menus now and we'll talk about the way it used to work. Okay, enough with the menus. So how did it used to work? Which was really frustrating. Before, how it used to work is if you you're in C1M and you're shooting and you're making changes to shutter speed and aperture and ISO as you need to, be birds, lights coming in and out, birds are different colors, white, black, all that kind of stuff. And then, but there's nothing happening for a while. So your camera would go automatically shut off when it came back on. But then here comes something. Here comes a bird. And you hit half press or whatever to wake up your camera, and it had reverted back to the original settings of C1 that you had set for C1. Well, that's a bummer. Now it doesn't work that way like we just went through. What it does now is it'll save those settings doesn't really save them. It'll keep those settings. Let's not say save. It'll keep those settings. Even if you turn the camera off and come back days later and you're still in C1, you never left C1, shooting mode, it'll keep those same settings. It'll be there. The minute you get out of C1, however, the second, the microsecond that you, I mean, maybe even nanosecond, I don't know, but instantly, once you change from C1, for example, to M, those settings revert back, the C1 settings revert back to what you had originally registered to C1. So then you go back into C1 5 minutes later, and now your aperture, ISO, and shutter speed, for example, are set back to what you registered into C1 originally. That's a good way to make it work, I think. That's a good way for it to work. And that's the way it works now. So, C1, C2, C3. For me, just a quick summation here. For me, they're for changing between major types of shooting. From shooting birds, to shooting landscapes, to shooting the Milky Way, astrophotography. Lots of different changes that need to be made in many different menus. So easy just to go to C1, C2, or C3 for that. I don't use C1, C2, C3 for these minor things, like going from perch birds to flying birds, or go from when it's cloudy to when it's sunny. I mean, I'm just in M, manual mode, changing my aperture, shutter speed, and ISO as I need to, because I didn't really change situations. I'm still shooting birds or mammals or wildlife in general. You can use them however you want, but I hope at least now you know what to expect, how to set them up, and then how they're going to behave. So hey, if you like my channel, please subscribe, turn on notifications, all that kind of stuff. Because when you hit, hey, like the video, like it. Like it. Because YouTube likes it when you like it. And then more people will see the video. You know, I get, and I know you're out there, I get instant, I post a video, basically instantly, after a video goes live, to you all out there. I get between 1 and 3 dislikes instantly. And I think it's the same people out there doing that. They don't like me for some reason. I don't know, maybe they're Sony shooters and they think Canon sucks. Whatever, you know. But if you would, please like my video if you like it. Please subscribe to my channel if you like it. Because it all helps me continue to do more videos that at least some of you find useful, valuable. Hey, so until next time, have great light, take great pictures, be safe out there. I'll see you soon.